Sorry. Thanks very much. That's a really kind introduction. So this is as Chris called it, a two-hander. And I think we are going to try and cover much the same ground, but from slightly different positions within the system and understanding. So what I'm going to try and do is sort of present a very broad picture of what we mean by late capitalism, what it is, how it functions, and just to start showing you in not so much detail, but just position rearmament and permanent austerity is absolutely central to what brackets dysfunction and temporary maintenance of capitalism today. So what I'm going to try and show is how permanent austerity is how capitalist interests are maintained at home, whilst the rearmament facilitates capitalist interests overseas, right, internationally. And as John said earlier in the opening plenary, it's capitalist competition and empire are symbiotically related. One necessitates the other, and that's what I sort of want to start to show in very broad brushstrokes. And this is going to cover a lot of ground. I had 11 slides with about 15 charts. I'm going to do 4 slides, okay? But if people want to do more, they are all there. So if people are really into graphs and they really want to have a closer look at them, then we can do in the discussion. I like graphs. Okay, so what is late capitalism? Well, it's, many people have discussed it, but really, I think the first thing to think about it is it's the culmination of 200 plus years of capitalist competition. And I think you really need to understand this in relation to how competition takes place and how capitalism restructures itself to maintain itself in relation to this competition. So, and as we mentioned already, imperialism is an absolute, kind of symbiotically related aspect of capitalism. And I'm going to say something about how the new imperialism, just like the old imperialism, is driven by these internal dynamics of capitalism and the inherent contradictions. So what does capitalism look like? This is a bit capitalism 101. I'm sure many people here already know it, but I'm just going to go through some very broad concepts. The first is, I think, people know that individual capitalists are driven by the imperative of profit, right? So the accumulation of surplus value, which is created only through the exploitation of labour and production. So that necessitates individual capitalists to go and exploit labour and, extract some of this surplus value. So but as a whole, capitalists compete with each other in the market. Each one is trying to capture more of the market. Each one is trying to increase its share of the pie, right? Its overall profits. And it does this initially by producing as much as it can and reducing costs as much as possible, right? So this is like the kind of basic building block of capitalist competition. And this has necessitated technological innovation, right? So that, this is where Marx himself said that this is an extremely progressive system, capitalism, because it does drive technological change, via competition. But this technical change is narrowly focused on maximizing profits for the individual capitalist, right? So because of that, the technological change that develops is not there to benefit society as a whole, but will tend to be labor displacing, right? It's a way, so this is, so it's like kind of, we see this with automation. I mean, these are discussions we're having today, right, everywhere. So it tends to be labor displacing, but as I already mentioned, surplus value can only be created through the exploitation of workers, right? This is labor power. With more technology, you have more technology or more machines per unit labor. And that just means that your additional bit of profit you get for every additional bit of production is start to go down. And that's the rate of profit. So this is, in a nutshell, Marx's theory of the tendency of the rate of profit to decline, right? So people can make loads of profit still, but the rate of profit, that additional bit of profit, will tend to decline with capitalist competition. What does that do? That pushes even more intense competition, right? And the more intense competition that necessitates further, as Luxemburg and Lenin said, imperialist endeavour, colonialism, the search for greater markets, the search for cheaper labour, and the assurance of all of this through mechanisms of violence and warfare, right? So as well as trade regulation, etc. Right? So these other things. So this is really key to what we discussed. So that's been happening for a long time. So what's late about late capitalism, right? So people like Ernest Mandel that use the term late capitalism said, well, it's the rise of finance capital. And I think Lenin also talked about finance capital, as did Marxist economist Rudolf Hilferding. They talked about the idea that, as a rate of, with the tendency of the long-term decline in the rate of profit, you need to try and amass as much as possible, right? And you can do that through finance, through your command over finance, financial systems, financial structures. Okay, and this is largely what we have seen, particularly in the waning period of the post-war boom from the 70s onward, this shift towards finance and neoliberalism and financialization being absolutely handed down. So neoliberalism is a restructuring that we've seen that allows financialization to take off. And this is largely in the Western or global North. So when we talk about financialization, we're talking about the accumulation of wealth, right? So wealth rather than capital which is productive that you put back in and invest and produce more. Instead of accumulating that, you're accumulating wealth, assets that increase in value over time without necessarily having to do anything to increase that value, right? So this is largely speculative. It's largely about who has control over what and the sort of monopoly power that is distributed in society. So I just wanted to show in 4 graphs, I don't know if you can see much of this, what I think is a really nice, I mean, these are a little bit old now, but it's one of the earlier writers around financialization, Gabriel Palmer, and I've written this because this is the title, his title of his paper. It's Financialization as It's Not Meant to Make Sense, Gigantic Global Joke. And these are the various subheadings, subtitles of his, that you can decide which ones to use. But I think the main thing to show, this is for the US, but we can see similar things for the UK, and I've got those graphs, but I won't show them now, but if you want to see them, I'll show them later. But what I've got here, 79 is this line. That's the year I was born as well, actually. But this is what we see as sort of the launch of the project of neoliberalism, right? And it's marked by kind of deregulation, opening of capital accounts, deregulation of finance, deregulation across all sorts of other areas of the economy. And what you've got at the top is private investment as a share of income of the top 10% in society from 1947 until 2014 or thereabouts. And what you see is, if we had sort of the standard traditional accumulation, what you would see is investment would continue to increase, right? This is what you would see in China. In this period, what you'd see in China is investment as a share of income for the top 10% in society would be increasing, right? But in the US, it's been falling, and this is what we see in the UK as well. So this whole question of the crisis of investment, right? This is what we've been seeing. At the same time, so this is just for the top 1%, so similar story. And what you see here is also a greater tying of the income stream of the top 10% with the financial assets as a share of GDP. So these are moving very closely together. So what we're seeing is the income, what is coming in, what the top 10% of wealthiest people are receiving as income is from the increase in the value of financial assets. And this is a similar thing around kind of private investment falling with an increasing share of income to the top 10%. So you've got worsening inequality, much lower investment in the domestic economy, and huge inflation in financial asset prices, right? I think this is stuff that people here probably know, but I think it's really important that we tie those together and say, this is what we mean by financialization, right? This is...
Sorry, before you move on, could you explain that just again, those graphs, please?
Sure. So this is how much the richest 10% are investing back into the economy. Okay. So in just like machines, businesses, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And normally in capitalism, if the capitalists are the most dynamic members of society, as some people, apologists of capitalism like to tell us, we would see that increasing over time. They would be, in order to expand accumulate more, they invest more, and that's how you expand. But we don't see that. From 1979, it's the opposite. It's been falling. But they're not getting poorer. But they're getting richer, but their wealth is coming from the increase in value of financial assets.
They're holding on to the money instead of putting it back into the...
Yes, sort of, yeah, largely. But they're investing in financial assets that they want to maintain the value of. And I'll say something about that in relation to housing before I hand to Chris shortly. Okay. Right. Okay. So this is largely what we've done. So what we can say about late capitalism, it's marked by accumulation of wealth, this financialized accumulation, what Marx would have called the accumulation of interest-bearing capital over productive capital. It's money seeking to make money without getting its hands dirty in production, right? So this is really what we're seeing. It's highly speculative, and but at the same time, where does value come from? Labour. So you have to have production somewhere, right? So this is only part of the story. This is often what the post-Keynesians tell us is the story, but this is only part of the story. The Marxists come to say, well, where's all the production happening and what's happening there, right? And this is where we get the question of imperialism re-emerging, okay? So I'm not going to show a graph for a minute. So what we've, actually I could show you a graph. So let's have a graph of what's happening. So on the other side of the coin, the wealthiest are getting wealthier. The poor and the working class are getting poorer. And what you see over the same period of time is that, like capital are trying to squeeze as much out of everything as it can, out of finance, out of labor. So in the US, and there's a similar delinking in the UK, is you get a decoupling between what workers are paid per hour and the output they make for the capitalists. Before they used to track much more closely, from around 79, 80, you get that decoupling. So the share of the pie going to workers is getting lower and lower, and that's very much connected to, oh my goodness, is that 15 minutes already? Oh wow, that's very much connected to, I shouldn't have answered your question. That's very much connected, yeah, that's very much connected to the need to squeeze more and more out, okay, and also labour repression and the attack on trade unions. Okay. So this has all been premised upon a changing division of labour. So where has all this production gone to? Well, it's gone to the global south. So this is quite an old chart now, but this is looking at the millions of workers in the industrial sector. They've got more developed, less developed regions. This is global north, global south. And so what you've seen is a stagnation of industrial workers, as we know, a massive rise in the global south. And this is the so-called rise in global value chains, global supply chains, and another version of imperialism where capital is kind of outsourcing and putting at arm's length more and more production. So they don't deal with the costs of it, but because of monopoly power, they're able to extract more and more. So this is a real architecture of kind of the new imperialism. And there's lots of studies now that quantify this increasing unequal exchange and the role of super exploitation, right? So this is really driving down the value of labor power in some of these areas. And this is also partly how, given the opportunity for China to rise, right? So this outsourcing has largely gone to China. And China, because of its size of economy and the role of the state, has really been able to harness this. And in China, you would have seen, actually, if you looked at that, as I said, that graph of investment, it would have gone up and up and up and up. And it did. But so many people go, oh, well, China's this great, we need to be like China. And in fact, you see lots of people who are traditionally quite conservative going, we need to be less speculative and more like China. Let's get the state to do more investment. But I think we need to be really careful about this argument, because actually China is not a socialist utopia. It is a capitalist economy, and its capitalist characteristics are increasingly visible. So I'm just going to show those, and I'm not going to say anything about housing, but if you want to talk about housing, we can talk about that later, which is the permanent austerity bit. But this is China's private and public property wealth. And we can see, it's not a state-led economy anymore. And private wealth, this only goes up 2015, and you can see this going really increasingly higher and higher. You also see growing inequality in China. This is the share of income for the top 10%. It's approaching sort of US levels of inequality here. Right? This is not what you would expect from a socialist economy. You also see much more kind of connections to finance, more increasing speculative activities. And not only that, but we know that this is they are now part of the same inter-imperialist rivalry that we would expect. So this is just a final note before I move to Chris, and if you want to talk about housing, we can discuss that in the discussion. But this is just to show really the massive increase in military spending by China. Chris I think is going to say much more about Europe and US, but this is happening. This is inter-imperialist, inter-capitalist competition, right? So this is really how we need to understand this permanent this state of rearmament, as well as a permanent state of austerity, which I didn't have time to go into, but just to say that it's been in the UK, if you look at the housing sector, for example, the move towards financialized accumulation has gone hand in hand with, and it's locked into, the withdrawal of the state and the provisioning for housing, as well as deregulation of mortgage markets to a point, and now the provisioning for old age. So all of that has totally locked in this sort of moment of permanent austerity. So I'm going to end there, and I'm sorry I went over time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Susie.